My name is Kay Byfield, and this is your ArtSpeaks Studio moment from ArtSpeaks Studio in Dallas, Texas. And today I want to talk about exploiting the principles of design in order to make better paintings. The truth is that artists have always known that in order to do a good artwork, there were some general elements that go into artworks, and there were some principles of organization about how to arrange those elements in order to get the best painting. The trouble is, most people don't know what those are. If you study art in college, you will be required to take design classes. But if you start painting in a different way, you may not know very much at all. And I'm a huge proponent of using those elements and principles that we know so much about to best advantage in order to get the strongest, most powerful paintings that we can get. The problem is that while the elements of design, line, size, shape, value, color, texture, and space, are pretty much the same on most lists. Some of them will add one or another, but they stay pretty consistent. The principles of design bounce all over the place. Everywhere you look, there's a different list. And this is very difficult. So where you can see I memorized the elements of design, I couldn't begin to tell you all the different lists of 7 or 8 principles that I learned back in the day. And when I went to look at my paintings to try to evaluate them to see where I could make them stronger, I didn't know what worked and what didn't work. So today I want to propose a much simpler list, one that is universal, that we could all use, and that will work on almost any painting. So I'm paring down the list and I'm picking out what is most functional. So here are all the contenders for this list of principles of organization that might be on the list. They all appear on different lists. Some of them, like balance, appears on every list. So what I propose to do is go through them and explain why they work or don't. So the way I'm going to make my selection is using a couple criteria. One, if something appears on almost all the lists, then I'm going to give it very great consideration. If something is a subset of something else, that it kind of falls under something else, then I will go with the thing that it is part of. So for instance, if a list said that we should include radial balance, informal balance, and symmetry, those are all 3 kinds of balance. So instead, I would just put them all under balance. Okay, so before I can pare these down, I need to explain the purpose of the principles of design. Principles for any activity or behavior are rule sets and fundamental truths. They are intended to be used as guides in order to maximize your success in that endeavor. The principles of art are guidelines that, if they are followed, will result in strong, effective works of art. But if the different qualities of art are listed and are not concrete enough to be evaluated, they're useless on that list. So before I begin to analyze all the contenders for the list of principles of design, I need to establish the qualifications for being part of that list. So like I said before, in order to be included on the list, a principle must be inclusive. It must be used in most, if not all, works of art. And so many of the principles that appear on many of these lists are ones that appear occasionally, but not all the time. For instance, gradation. We don't see gradation everywhere. We just see it in some artworks. And so I would consider putting that under something else. In addition, the principle must be something that can be accessible, that it can be evaluated. And this is a problem for principles on the lists, including unity, which of course is the goal of every artwork, is to be unified in some way, right? So how do we assess unity? If it's a successful artwork, it's unified. But we can't look at it and say, well, it's not unified. That doesn't help us any. But we can say, I don't see any repetition of this red anywhere. It's not balanced. It's not cohesive, which means it's not unified. So unified in that case is redundant. I would argue for the same thing in harmony. What does harmony mean? It means it works together. It's cohesive, in other words. So I would take harmony and unity off the list right away, because they are not something that you can evaluate in a way that is concrete. So the most obvious principle of design to include in the list is balance. And the reason is that balance is on every list. Almost every artwork needs to be balanced. There are very few that won't be balanced in some way. And the three kinds of balance are formal balance, where the left and the right side are exactly the same, and so it's extremely stable and therefore balanced psychologically. The most common form of balance is informal balance or asymmetrical balance, where it feels like it's balanced, but it's like a teeter-totter with somebody heavy scooted forward and the lighter people on the other side further out, and so the teeter-totter balances. So for instance, you could have something very bright or very dark that's smaller, and on the other side it's balanced by things that are lighter and less bright, and so there is an equal psychological weight. You could have dense textures versus less dense textures. You could have, it can be color, it can be value, it can be texture, it can be size, it can be shape. But it would feel balanced in that way. So balance is an obvious inclusion for our list, and of course it's on every list. I would argue that repetition is necessary, but that rhythm and gradation are both kinds of repetition. So why do we need all three? Gradation is repetition with a little variation, a small step variation of some kind. And of course, all of these can apply to any of the elements. So you can have a gradation in texture where it goes from dense texture to less dense texture, or a gradation in size where it goes from smaller to bigger, or a gradation in color or in value or in line. Gradation can be anything, but it's all a form of repetition. So repetition goes on the list, but not pattern, not rhythm, not gradation. But repetition without variety is going to be boring. So just like the stars, which is just a repeat all the way across, become boring because there's nothing to set them off or make them more interesting, we must have variety. Too much variety, however, leads to chaos. So we need repetition and variety together. They always work in tandem. As an addition to that, I don't think proportion should be on the list, because proportion is relative amounts of something. So we're talking about variety. All we're doing is talking about how much variety. So proportion is unnecessary because it falls under variety. I believe contrast should be on our list because we need to have a place where the eye goes, and then we need contrast in other places to move around the surface of the piece. So contrast definitely goes on our list, but I don't see that there's a real difference between dominance, which is the highest contrast, or emphasis, which again is where you go first, which is what is the most important, all of those are part of contrast. So I would argue we need contrast, but we do not need those other terms. I also don't think we should be talking about movement. If we're going to put movement any place, it probably needs to go in the elements. But I don't know that we need movement. Movement is just one of the things that we want to depict, perhaps, right? So I wouldn't include movement. Oftentimes people confuse the term movement, which should mean catching the action of something on a still surface, a painting, and we imply that either by stop action, by blurring, something is moving and therefore it's blurred, or by repetition to show that something is moving. Eye tracking, on the other hand, is looking at the way the eye moves around the surface of the piece, and that is the goal of all of the principles of design, is to engage the viewer, get them to look at it, and keep them looking at it for the longest possible amount of time. So now we just have 4 principles that are easy to remember. We have variety and repetition, we have balance, and we have contrast. And so if we want a successful artwork, we need to ensure that we have really considered and made it work, that there will be repetition with variety and balance and contrast in multiple places. So here are the key questions that we need to ask ourselves. Is it balanced? What is balancing what? Can it be less predictable and still balanced? Because too balanced is very predictable, and predictable is boring. Next, is there repetition? Which elements are being repeated? Are there other places where that element should be repeated? The typical rule of thumb is you need at least 3 repetitions of any element once you've introduced it. So if you have red one place, you have to have red at least 2 other places that move the eye around. Doesn't need to be the same red, but it needs to be reddish. The third question is there variety? What kind? Where is it? Is it interesting? Is there more that needs to be included? And the last one is there contrast? What elements are being contrasted? You can have large shapes and small shapes, or bright colors and dull colors, or heavy texture and lighter texture. You can have contrast in any of the elements, thick lines and thin lines, short lines and long lines, etc., etc. But you need to be sure that there is contrast, that there is a focal point, and that there are secondary and tertiary focal points that move the eye around the surface. If you do these things, if you include balance, variety, repetition, and contrast in your paintings, you will have stronger paintings. I hope this information is helpful to you, and I wish you happy painting. Bye.